for expansion in a dramatic way. And the first thing he did in terms of the preparation for this, he's thinking about it from the very beginning of his administration. So long before even the Louisiana Purchase, the first thing he does is he finds someone who he thinks will be the leader of the expedition. And the man he's going to find is a fellow Virginian, a lieutenant in the United States Army, a man by the name of Meriwether Lewis. And Meriwether Lewis will become, of course, one of the very famous components of Lewis and Clark. Now, I always like to at least consider his first name, and then, I always like, what's going on with that, of course. And I always shorten everything, every name I have of my family. So would you call him Mary? Would you call him Weather? What are you going to do with that, of course? And I do want you to know on the expedition he was called Captain Lewis, so there's no problem there, But Meriwether Lewis, of course, becomes a critical figure in this. Meriwether Lewis, at the time, I think, in late 20s, very able individual, extraordinarily intelligent, very courageous, brave person. Ultimately, in many ways, a perfect person to lead this. I do want you to know that there's always intriguing. You look behind the story, of course, to see the actual man. And Meriwether Lewis, in many ways, was a deeply troubled person. It's wrong to do any kind of psychological interpretation of people who are long gone, but people think that he might have been like suffering from bipolar situation, high highs, but also some super low situations too. And in those days, of course, how do you deal with that? You self-medicate with alcohol, the only way you could do it. And the tragic outcome here is that I think it's like 3 years after the end of the Lewis and Clark expedition, he shoots himself to death. And it's not exactly clear if it was a suicide. It's one of those things that sometimes it could have been an accident. He was inebriated, there's no doubt about that, but the thing that becomes troubling is that he shot himself in the stomach, and you guys all know that gut shooting yourself is not exactly the way of suicide. Indeed, it led to probably a prolonged and painful death for Meriwether Lewis. So it very well may have been a drunken accident or something like that. Anyway, but a sad individual, of course, who never could quite find his footing and find his happiness in the aftermath. But one thing about this is these people often have golden moments, and I do think he had a golden moment, and the golden moment was, of course, of his moment of leading the Lewis and Clark expedition. So, very able individual to say the least, and a very good expedition leader. Now, Jefferson brings Lewis into the White House to learn everything he needs to know. He's going to live there, and Jefferson was like the man who knew everybody, who knew everything in America. So he brought in the finest doctors in America to teach Lewis, all the first aid issues. And I'm convinced that Lewis was basically a doctor. I mean, he was as good as any doctor at that particular time, right? But he was also taught cartography or mapping. He was taught scientific taxonomy. He was taught orienteering. All the things that you needed to know basically for navigation. All these things were taught to Lewis. And when it was done, I mean, he was totally prepared. Totally prepared to lead this thing, make this thing happen. Now, in 1803, he's given carte blanche to go on this. And Congress makes an appropriation, the money's there, and Jefferson's, make it happen. Do it. I've set you up with everything you need, make it happen. And the intriguing thing is the first thing that Lewis did was he gained himself a partner. Now, he realized the difficulty of what he was going to embark upon, and he was smart enough to know that he needed someone to help him. So he turned to a friend and a fellow Army officer from Virginia, a man by the name of William Clark. And William, there is a little bit of flakiness in Lewis, of course, and we see it in the journal. He's kind of there sometimes, and maybe not quite so much there. But Clark seems to be this solid rock, and the two of them will function wonderfully. It's a marriage made in heaven, essentially, that will make this all happen. But William Clark will become, the other side of the equation. Now, Lewis by this time is a captain, and Clark was simply a lieutenant. But Lewis insisted that they be equals in terms of the expedition. So Lewis goes to Jefferson and says, can we get Clark promoted, of course? And Jefferson at least made a suggestion to the military, but you guys all know the Army doesn't want to be told what to do about things like promotion. So the technical reality was that when they go on the expedition, it's technically Captain Lewis and Lieutenant Clark. But Lewis decided to make it just simply the fiction of the expedition, and so the two of them were both captains perceived as equal as far as it's Captain Clark and Captain Lewis, even though really Clark is just a lieutenant, okay? But Lewis will find, of course, in Clark the perfect partner, and the two of them will just do an amazing job, making this all happen. Now, together, they were given basically, carte blanche to create the organization that would conduct the expedition. And I do really like the way it would be described. It would be called the Corps of Discovery, the Corps of Discovery. And I just think it's a cool name for any kind of, I'd love to be part of a Corps of Discovery. It is the beginning of what will evolve to become the U.S. Topographical Corps, which will ultimately evolve to become the U.S. Geological Survey, the chief exploratory geographical agency of the United States of America. So this is the first iteration of what is still here today, even, okay? That Corps of Discovery will ultimately be composed of 42 people, more or less. You know, I always have a little trouble giving the absolute number. The vast majority of them were simply soldiers, and Lewis and Clark were given this ability to go to forts, as they're heading out to the west, to choose, or any military facility, to choose anyone that they thought was going to be, would be good for the Corps of Discovery. And they looked for strong, physical, enduring people, but they also looked for soldiers that would get along, would be collaborative, and could make this happen. And I do need to tell you one, I think, very remarkable part of the story. These guys are gone for more than 2 years, and yet there are only 2 cases of military discipline that have to be dealt with. In both cases, it was a sentry issue. One guy got drunk while being a sentry. The other fell asleep while being a sentry. And of course, the military takes that stuff very, very seriously. And I think both of them would be flogged for every day for a week or something like that. But if you think about it, that many soldiers with that few disciplinary issues, clearly they chose very well. Had people that are going to make this whole thing happen. Right? Now, I do want you to know that there were special other members of the expedition. This is totally off the issue, but it's part of it, that Clark brought along his really big Newfoundland dog, so that's a big black dog. You guys ever seen those suckers before? But they're both really interesting, but they're kind of gross. Those big dogs just drool all the time. My friends who lived in Stowe, Massachusetts had one, and he would walk by me. It was the summertime. It's like leave a swath on my leg whenever he walked by. And I remember one time I'm sitting across the room from it, but it shook its head just to shake off and a little splat hit me in the face coming all the way across it. But I think that big dog was it was intriguing for Native Americans and others to get to see that. But from a personal note, just one of the more fascinating members of the expedition was a man by the name of York. York was the only African American, and of course York was also a slave. William Clark was a Southerner from Virginia who wouldn't go anywhere without his personal manservant, so York will accompany him all the way across the entire continent. York was an incredible physical specimen. He was a tough individual. He will be an integral part of the entire expedition, critical for its ultimate success in so many ways. Intriguingly, he was part of like the diplomacy with the Native Americans, and that they weren't that impressed by white people, but they'd never seen a black person before, and they wanted to touch him and they wanted to touch his hair. So he became part of like the diplomatic interactions between the Corps of Discovery and the Native Americans, and just a critical person. I have to say this part because this pisses me off more than anything. Every single member of that expedition was rewarded in a significant way, but the only one who's given nothing basically for his troubles is York. You would think the minimum of reward would be, freedom, and he will ultimately be free, but much later. And it always makes you really mad that Clark was unwilling to really recognize the critical nature and contribution of York and to reward him for that. Of all the members of the Corps of Discovery, though, beyond Lewis and Clark, the most famous by far was a woman, and she was a Shoshone woman, and this is how Lewis writes her name out in the journal, Sakakawea. So I think that's the way that we should say it. You hear Sacagawea, stuff like that, but this is the phonetic spelling of Lewis, Sakakawea. So I'm going to say Sakakawea. Sakakawea was a young woman. She was a Shoshone woman who had been kidnapped by the Hidatsu, who had been brought down onto the plains, who had been traded, and at this moment she actually was, I guess you would say the wife, but even in some ways the possession of a French fur trapper by the name of Charbonneau. And she was brought along primarily because of her translator ability. She could speak a variety of languages. And the Shoshone had never seen white people before, so they thought it would be important to have someone who would kind of help out in that regard. But it's just amazing how important she becomes as far as the expedition is concerned. One part of it is just, totally unintended, but when the Native Americans, especially the Plains Indians, would see a group of men crossing their lands, of course these men were unknown men, they would assume it was a war party and they would deal with it appropriately. War party, you better go get your gun, go get your bows and arrows and confront that. But whenever there is even just one woman with the group, it's no longer a war party. So just the simple presence of Sakakawea meant that it's going to reduce the potential of conflict. Native Americans said, "Oh, there's a woman with them. They must be something else. They're not a war party." So it's just that kind of really critical role. It was also critical when they did run into the Shoshone. So it just happens that they run into the Shoshone, and a member of that group is her brother, and it's hugs and kisses. You know, the Shoshone are going to open their arms to Lewis and Clark instead of course, being suspicious and resistant to them. And she was also just good in, helping them to find foods that they could eat. There's one time when they totally ignore her. She says, "Don't eat that. That's a bad thing." And they still ate it, and of course, it's like the entire Corps of Discovery gets the runs because of that. And Lewis would later call her the bravest member of the expedition. And she's not just she's a mother too. She's got a little baby, a papoose. Can't remember the name of the little baby, but kind of going along with the entire activity. But Sakakawea will prove to be fundamentally important as far as the entire expedition is concerned. Of course, one of the more famous members from our point of view. Well, I want to give you a sense, of course, of the expedition itself. I'm clearly giving you more than you could use for identification, so just try to take as much as you want. Get the salient points like the ones that I'm putting up in your face. The one thing I want you guys to know is that it is almost entirely a riverine voyage, so that means it's going to be on the river. So they headed out of St. Louis, Missouri in 1804, and with a variety of boats, pirogue, kind of rowboat situations, some canoes, a variety of these boats that they would do, heading up the Missouri River. And you guys all know that going upstream against the current has got to be kind of a difficult thing, of course, moving them. And they realized it would take them a long period of time. So the first season of travel will be going up the Missouri up to about here. So they would have been up in what you and I would call North Dakota. And they will establish a winter camp at a place they call it the Mandan Fort. They called it Fort Mandan, next to the Mandan villages. The Mandans build these subterranean kind of places, and so they could get out of the elements during the winter, especially. And they stayed right next to a Mandan River village, but they stayed on the other side of the river. So I guess they decided they didn't want to be quite so connected. But part of me always wonders, what it would have been like to just spend that long winter, cold day after cold day, of course, in really just almost like a subterranean activity, just waiting for this spring to come for the ice to thaw. When it did finally come, of course, and the river began to open up, they continued on the Missouri River, making a big arc and pushing it as far as they possibly could. In fact, at the very end, they were out of the boats, pushing them through shallow water, and there's a reason for that. I'll highlight in just a second. But finally, of course, they had to kind of give that up. They then, were kind of at the headwaters of the Missouri. They proceeded, of course, up into the mountains, and what they were going to crest was what we would call the Continental Divide. And I've always wanted to imagine that moment, because here's Lewis climbing up, and the Americans were not used to high mountains. That wasn't really something. The highest peak in the east is